Hello and welcome to this fun art tutorial. Today we'll be painting a watercolour artwork using only one colour, plus black and white, which in art, these are technically not colours. Instead, black is a shade and white is a tint. The term for using only one colour in art is monochromatic. So in this video, I'll be using the primary colour blue. To be more specific, Prussian blue. And as a teacher, I found that many young budding artists believe that watercolour is a very difficult medium to use and that it requires a lot of colour mixing. However, I'm going to show you today just how easy it can be to create an effective work of art only using blue. So before we begin, it'll be rude of me if I didn't introduce myself. My name is Ellie and I'm a practicing artist and art teacher living in Melbourne, Australia. I've just started this channel as I'm passionate about teaching informative and engaging art content, which I hope will inspire you to learn, create and enjoy the process along the way. So if that sounds good to you, please ensure that you like this video and subscribe for more content in the future. Firstly, you want to set up your space, ensuring that you've got a clean, flat surface to work on. Ensure you put down some newsprint paper or butcher's paper so you can keep your workspace clean and free from paint. Now before you begin painting, you want to use a light pencil, so I recommend an HB or lighter to draw out your design. Now the reason you want to keep it light is because you don't want to see the pencil once you've finished your painting, so you don't want to see it through your painting. So use a ruler and an image reference to help you get your proportions right. And that's, of course, is depending on what you're drawing or whether you would need a ruler or not. This is the image reference that I will be using here for this nice landscape piece. And if you're a beginner watercolorist, I would recommend to begin by picking a simple image. So either a photograph that you take yourself, or you can use plenty of royalty-free stock images that you can download online. Just, of course, ensure that you're always crediting the artist. And yeah, go for a landscape that has some sky and scenery in it. That's something that's a bit easier to start with. When painting landscapes, it doesn't matter too much that every single piece in the photograph is drawn the same on your page. So you don't need to be too picky about that. It's mostly important that you've got the basic elements in place on your page. Do ensure that your subject matter in the foreground is much larger than your subject matter in the background. Because when you would look at a beautiful scene, or an ocean scene in this case, you will notice that the things in the distance get smaller as they travel further and further into the distance. So please ensure that you have got a varying size reference in the foreground and background. So firstly, before we get started, you need to ensure that you have the correct materials to complete the painting. Just bear in mind that you don't need exactly the same brands that I use and could apply this monochromatic colour palette to any colour that you might wish to use, be it red, yellow, orange. So just ensure that you have some watercolour paper, 200 GSM or higher would be great. You need some watercolour paint, and in this case Prussian blue, white and black. You'll need a paint palette. You'll need some watercolour brushes, at least 2 different sizes or shapes. So I recommend to use a round brush and a short flat, which is what we'll be using during this video as well. A light pencil and no darker than HB, so I use an H. 2 small jars of water, newspaper, or in Australia we call it butcher's paper, a tissue or rag to wipe your brush, a fine liner as well to sign your work at the end, and fun. The most important part is that you have fun during this process. I'll speed the video process up at times and stop to explain sections of the process that are relevant to the techniques discussed today. Okay, so now let's begin. There's two main techniques we will discuss here to create an effective artwork using only Prussian blue. There's the wet on wet technique. This is the most basic technique using watercolour. When applying it to the painting process, it allows the pigment of the paint to be diluted with water, so you're getting a variance of how strong the colour hue appears on the page. A little tip is to use a tissue to wipe or blot out any excess water. Wet the paper first. The more water you have on the paper, the less control you have with the water. So a thin layer of water is enough, but make sure that you put enough down that it doesn't dry before you've applied the paint. Use your paintbrush to move the paint around in the water. The reason we want to use this technique in the background and the objects furthest away is to create depth within the painting, and this will make the things at the back lighter, in this case the clouds and the small islands in the water where the paint is more diluted, and the objects in the foreground, which is the front, the darkest where the paint is thicker and more opaque, so it means that you can't see through it. As well as using the wet on wet technique to create depth within the artwork, you also want to create tone within your work. To create tone or shading, you can use the hue, and the hue is the original saturated colour of Prussian blue. You can make it lighter by adding a tint, which is white, and you can also make it darker by adding a shade, which is black. By adding this gradually throughout the object, adds gradual tone, and in this case it gives it a three-dimensional form, changing it from a flat 2D shape to a curved and round 3D form like the clouds here. So depending on the amount of black or the amount of white you add, enables you to mix many different tones and many varieties of colour. So tone and form both fall under the list of art elements, and these are the foundation to visual imagery and enable you to create aesthetic qualities. These two methods, so creating depth using a wet on wet painting technique and creating tone by adding black and white, are two simple ways how you can create an effective work of art that you can be proud of. Tone and form is particularly important when painting clouds. So I have a separate video designated specifically how to effectively paint clouds, which is linked in the description box below. Check this one out after you've watched this video. There I discuss form in a lot more depth. As you can see, I'm completing this artwork in section using layers. Follow along like this if you're new to watercolour, otherwise you may prefer to paint the entire first layer to begin with over all of the paper. Keep watching to see how this progresses, and for some more important content in the finishing stages of completion of this artwork, keep watching and listening ahead. Throughout this process, also remember to regularly take a step back from your painting to view it from a different perspective. You may want to exaggerate the light and darker areas compared to how it looks in your photograph or image onto your painting itself. This will create a wider depth of tones and make it more eye-catching to the viewer. Let's discuss the wet and wet technique in more detail. The term wet and wet simply means that wet paint is applied to wet paper. This technique can be used across many paint mediums. When your paint dries, you will see the paint appears diluted and flat with less intensity to the colour hue. Notice here that the wet and wet technique creates blurred edges to the paint stroke and various transparency to the paint on my paper. Transparency means whether you can see through it. The effects you are getting are irregular and often unplanned. You will notice here that I'm also applying the wet on dry technique, where I'm adding the wet paint onto the dry paper. Do you see that the wet on dry technique allows you to paint in with greater and more intricate detail, as well as defining the sharp and pointed edges? You will also notice that when it dries, the paint appears much brighter and vibrant than the paint that you used during the wet and wet approach. So by being aware of how to use colour with the paint, hence knowing both of these ways to apply the watercolour paint, it will help you be in greater control of your painting process. We can also apply these painting techniques to create tone or shading within the scene, and this can be done using graduated blending. Using wet on dry to graduate your blending means using some diluted paint, so paint mixed with water, straight onto dry paper, then applying your brush to drag the wash gradually so it slowly appears faded. Ensure that you're using enough water so the paint is quite wet, because when it begins to dry, you'll notice that the brush strokes and uneven tones in your area of application. When you apply a graduated wash using wet and wet, again your intention is to apply a wash that changes from a dark to a lighter tone. This time though, remember to apply the water onto your paper first and use enough water to wet the paper so it's not drenched, as this won't allow you to have as much control of where the paint goes once you apply it down. Dab some paint onto your brush and apply onto the darkest area of your object or scene. Drag the paint across or in the direction of where the lighter area should be. Use a clean brush, or you can clean your existing brush, and drag the existing paint down gradually, creating a gradient from dark to light. Ensure that your brush strokes appear even and that your brush strokes go in the same direction. And remember that you can use a tissue if you accidentally apply too much water. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video and have learnt more about exactly how you can create an effective watercolour artwork using these two simple techniques. Please remember to like this video by hitting the thumbs up button and press the subscribe button with the notification bell on for more videos like this one to come. Until next time, my goodbyes, and I'll see you again soon.